This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
Welcome to From Guilt to Good, Self-Care Solutions for Busy Caregivers, the podcast rewriting the narrative of self-care. If you're a caregiver feeling stretched thin, torn between responsibilities, and longing for self-care, you're in the right place. I'm Jeanette Yates, a fellow caregiver and someone who spent years doing all the self-care things and never really feeling any better. After years of research, self-exploration, and trial and error, I finally found a way to create a sustainable self-care practice that made me feel good, not guilty. In From Guilt to Good, we'll explore how you can do that too. Together, we'll hear expert insights, actionable steps, and heartfelt stories to guide you toward rediscovering your worth, reclaiming your health, and getting back the life you've been too busy to enjoy. Today's guest is Jason Young, a nationally recognized consultant and leadership guide, keynote speaker, best-selling author, and university professor. He has over 25 years of experience working alongside well-respected churches and companies, a doctoral degree in hospitality, and is currently working on his Ph.D. in leadership trauma. And this, my friends, is why I asked him to join us today. Jason recently wrote a book, Don't Burn Out, Burn Bright, focusing on pastors and ministry leaders and how they can perform their roles without exhaustion, discouragement, and burnout. While caregivers aren't pastors, we certainly have much in common as both roles focus on caring for others. In today's episode, we'll discuss how burnout happens to people serving and leading others and what we need to do so that we can not burn out, but burn bright. Hey, Jason.
Hey, Jeanette. You know what? That is an amazing, whoever wrote that, a bio, AI. So that's what I did. I just plugged like stuff into AI and I said, like, create a bio that sounds really good. So thanks for that.
Yes. So, I feel like one of the reasons I asked you on here is because we're buds. We've been friends for a while, chit-chatting in our workspaces where we hang out. And, so I knew about you, but I did not know you were a university professor. That is so
really
fancy.
Oh yeah. Very fancy.
Yeah. That's one of my life goals is to be a professor at a university, but I might have to get more schooling.
It was on accident. Sometimes I feel like, man, wait till they figure me out. They're like, this guy's not as smart as we think. So, you know. But I'll tell you this. Fun fact, parenthetical note, my life was really changed because of a university professor. And so back in my, sophomore, junior year of college, I said to myself then, if I could ever have a chance to do that, because she was so transformative for me and the belief she had in me. I changed my major. I ended up doing the very things that she said I would do. And so it was just really powerful. So it's really a major driver as to why I do it.
Well, that is awesome. And, as a former teacher, a high school teacher, I can say that's why I became a high school teacher, is because the way some of those people made me feel. So, and speaking of teaching and professing as a professor, that's a form of caregiving in its way too, because you are really doing more than just teaching your subject area.
Yeah, for sure. I might even think more time is spent beyond those elements than in those elements.
Yes, for sure. Okay, so let's dive into today's topic. But first, one of the things that I ask all of my guests is share whatever you feel comfortable with. If you've had any caregiving experience, whether it's a personal caregiving experience or if you've worked with caregivers before, I would love to hear anything that you feel comfortable sharing.
So
with our
when I look back
listeners.
on my own life, I mean, my mom has two sisters, and so when it came to caregiving, they were the primary caregivers as it relates to my grandma. My grandma raised me for a number of years, but there were some elements for me that that I needed to step into to do that. And so there's that element. Same with my grandfather, and then my parents live with us now, and so they're still functional and do things, but there are, as time progresses, I am giving more care and doing more things, and my wife is doing that, and my 2 teenagers are doing that. So, which we did this on purpose. Finding ourselves very active inside of that world. Again, it looks one way right now, but I'm starting, even this has been a couple of years, I'm seeing, that move little by little.
Well, and hopefully because of the work you do with leaders and around burnout, you know enough to know, because a lot of caregivers go through that similar experience where the role of caregiver isn't something that they step into fully when it starts. It's like, oh, I'm just helping them. I bring groceries by once a week, or I just help them, with this or that from time to time. And then a few years goes down the road and you're like, wait, they're completely dependent on me. And I didn't know, I didn't know what was happening, but it sounds like you're really paying attention to how that role will gradually shift. And that happens for so many people, and we kind of stumble into it. But I think it's really important when we can to be aware that whatever that role, generally speaking, it starts small and gets bigger like a snowball. There's some cases where there's a diagnosis or something that happens quickly and it's thrust upon fairly quickly. But in general, it's that snowball effect. And if we can be intentional about setting boundaries as we go, or creating new boundaries when necessary, which we're going to talk about boundaries here in a minute. I think that's so important. But I love that you kind of got ahead of it and are like, well, they're still doing their thing and all that, but we're going to go ahead and have them start to incorporate them into your family, into your home. So I think that's a really, when possible, that's a really good idea. And to be intentional about it is the most important thing. So, all right. So, I am glad to know, and I'm sure our listeners are glad to know, that you are actively in that caregiving role, because you know what it is like. But you also have quite a bit of experience working with leaders. And so I want to kind of compare leadership and caregiving a little bit. So based on your role as a caregiver and your work with leaders, how do those two things compare in your mind? Yeah,
it's a really good question. Yeah, so from a leadership side, not just working with leaders, but being in the trenches, leading people, having a great day as a leader and having a day as a leader that the worst ever, I'm going to quit. I'm going to go do something else. I thought a million times over. So I just want to say that on the front end, that there's been some of the struggles and the wins in the trenches, not just coming alongside of leaders. And I think that actually enriches it, because I think there's an increased level of empathy, from that perspective. The similarities between the two, and again, they're unique in their own way, right? But the similarities, when you think about kind of a church staff person, caregiver, you're paying attention to someone else. You feel an element of responsibility for someone else. You are serving someone else. When you don't feel like it, you're still doing it. You sometimes prioritize, or oftentimes prioritize them over you. You maybe struggle with boundaries in both of those roles. So again, those aren't exhaustive lists, but there are some similarities, and part of it is functional, but part of it is because there's a nature of an individual that needs something from you. And that is an okay thing. And then the dark side of it, if you will, and I'm sure we'll touch on this, is if you're not careful, you can abandon you. And so your very attempt in both roles to serve and care and love and give attention to the other person, when you forget you, abandon you, intentionally or unintentionally, and again, maybe it's a progression, you drift that way. If you're not careful, you don't find yourself to be at the healthiest spot. Well, then guess what? You're not the best caregiver. You're not the best church staff member. what are you? Well, you're living off an empty tank. So is it preventable? I think so. Are there certain situations where it could be unique and more of an anomaly? I think so. But I don't know. Maybe that comparison, hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, I love that the first thing that you said for a comparison is that some days you want to quit. Because I think every caregiver is like, there are some days where you're like, I just cannot do this anymore. There's also days where we're like, we are rocking this caregiving thing. I mean, I need to be on the front of Caregiver magazine because I am doing a great job. And then most days, though, it's more of like there's that guilt piece that comes into play where it's like, I'm not doing enough, I'm not good enough and stuff like that. But I will say there are some days where I'm like, I've made all the phone calls and I've signed all the papers and I've done all the things and I feel really great. But most of the time there's a struggle against that guilt that's like, you're just not doing enough, which you mentioned something just now when you were listing the similarities and you were talking about this idea of, someone else needing us and us, giving of ourselves or prioritizing other people, and that we abandon ourselves often. And this, of course, is one of my purposes in creating the self-caregiver community. And this podcast is to remind caregivers that they exist as people before and after and during their caregiving role. But as someone of faith, and, you and I come from a Christian faith, but there's other faiths that may have the same ideology. This idea that we deny ourselves for other people is something that a lot of us walk around with. And it's like, well, I'm not doing enough if I'm not denying myself. And can you talk a little bit about how that sometimes can be a slippery slope, especially when it comes to abandoning ourselves?
Yeah. So, it's interesting when you start pondering on, I'm not doing enough. And my follow-up question is, says who? Right. And oftentimes this is self-induced. Now, we could be as a caregiver or somebody on a church staff. Fortunately, or unfortunately, we have some people that tell us these things, right? And so you may be in that situation that you're like, they're literally telling me that. In most, I would hope it's not. And what I find is that there's this self-imposed thing. It's self-inflicted. But what's interesting, it actually has some roots somewhere. And I know we don't have time to go super, super deep, but there are some roots somewhere. For example, let me just kind of play this out personally. So how I was raised, in light of a few situations when I was younger, I, as a kid, kind of out of a forced scenario, developed this enormous sense of responsibility. Well, that sounds very noble. In fact, it gets celebrated. I get a lot done. People are like, oh, this kind of... But the struggle that they don't see is I don't ask for help. I suffer in silence. Yeah. And I will keep saying yes, 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 because there's just this burden, if you will. So it's a question I often ask, when I work with leaders. I'll ask this question. What is something from your childhood that shows up in your work? So maybe the question is, what's something from your childhood that shows up in how you give care to someone? And for me, it's this responsibility thing, and it sounds great, and it gets celebrated. But I also realize, Jason knows, there's a dark side. I do this frequently, the 3 examples I just gave you. So when you think about, the context of what we're talking about, it is realizing, is this other-induced? And then that would be another conversation. Is this self-induced?
Right.
Okay, I need to navigate that and begin to identify some things. And I know we'll maybe talk about some of that, the guilt and pieces. But I have to own what I can own. I have to control what I can control. Mm-hmm. And then beyond that, I have to kind of let it be. And you say, well, Jason, that sounds easier said than done. You're right. You're absolutely right. But I spend way too much care about what I cannot control. And then I don't get going on what I do control, which then adds to the weight of what I can't control. And then all of a sudden I'm in this vortex and I'm like, you know what? I got control over nothing. And then I'm going towards exhaustion and burnout. And it's like, hey, just press pause for a sec, and kind of reevaluate. So I don't know if that answers the question, because it's tough. It's very tough.
Yeah. So one of the things I think that, I want to mention two things that you said, because I love that you asked the question, like, if we're hearing in our mind's ear, in our self-talk, if we're hearing you're not doing a good enough job, or I'm not a good enough caregiver, to ask the question, who says? And, I'm going to up the ante a little bit, Jason, where I'm going to say, I don't think it matters. I mean, it does. Certainly I advocate going to therapy and figuring out some of that stuff, but whether it's self-inflicted or self-brought in, or someone else is actively telling you that, I think it's important to take a pause, like you mentioned, and ask yourself, what does it mean to be a caregiver? To me. So you define what being a caregiver means for you, what your capacity is to caregive, not what your loved one thinks your capacity is, not what the insurance company thinks your capacity is, not what your culture and upbringing and religion might have told you it was. Because sometimes, and I'm not saying like disregard your faith, but, sometimes we misinterpret what we think we understand from our faith. So, but to ask yourself, what is my capacity for caregiving right now? And to what we just talked about a minute ago, Jason, what your capacity is for caregiving right now is maybe different than from what it is in 10 years or, down the road. And so you have to constantly define and refine and redefine that. And that has helped me have more confidence in my caregiving, which of course it was that self-care piece of going, stop beating yourself up about being a bad caregiver, redefine what you can do as a caregiver and be honest with yourself, assess your energy level, I have other family that in my life that I'm caring for too, and a job and all those things, assess that. And once I did that and I said, this is what I'm able to do, and that is enough. Whether anybody else thinks it's enough, that isn't really any of my business.
Well, you said something.
I have to know.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I just have to know that. And now it takes practice. Like you said, is it easy?
Yeah.
No. Did it happen overnight? Absolutely not. But every time I get that feeling of you're not doing enough, I just go back to, what's your definition of caregiving? Does it need to change? Has your capacity changed? And then assess that.
No. I was actually going to affirm, really compliment. You said one thing in there, that this isn't a one and done decision. It's the same whether you work in a church staff or you're a caregiver. It's not like a one and done. There is this evolution of the situation, the evolution of the individual or people, the evolution of context, the evolution of your own capability and capacity, and et cetera, et cetera. So it is paying attention to the movement of these things, realizing that you can expect it to change. And when it does, it's okay. So it's not a one and done. There's actually a chapter in the book that talks about knowing you are enough. Because one of the things that contributes to exhaustion and burnout are the voices inside of our own head. And some of those are ours. Some of those are voices that somewhere in our life are still with us. Now, some of those could be good. Some of those may be really debilitating. But in this particular context, knowing you're enough, if you think one way, that's how you show up. Right? And so you may compensate, for whatever that might be. And so realizing that you're enough can be, and again, we could talk about that a whole nother session, but knowing you're enough does a powerful thing, in that it prevents you from journeying into, exhaustion and burnout. And again, maybe even defining those words would be helpful, because both of them, they feel dirty, but they may not be as bad as you think, or one is more than the other. So.
Right. And that was going to be my next thing. I'm glad you brought up the book, because I know that, like you said, you are a leader, you've been a leader, you've worked with leaders. And then, of course, you did a ton of research for this book, I'm sure, because I know you. And, let's talk a little bit about why burnout happens. And if you want to take a second and talk about what, just like what burnout is. We talked about it with one of our other guests as well. She was talking about it in the sense of caregiver fatigue versus caregiver burnout. And like you said, one of them, fatigue is not as bad as burnout.
Yeah.
But so if you want to go ahead and explain what burnout is and why do you think it happens in leadership
so
or
high
caregiving?
level, brief. If you think about exhaustion, you could change your calendar, change eating habit, change maybe exercise, take a day off. Like you could tweak some things. You can move the dials, adjust the levers just a little bit, and you can actually bounce back, and it could take a relatively short amount of time. The burnout side of things is a psychological syndrome. And so the exposure to excessive or prolonged levels of stress begins to impact how you feel about you, begins to show up in things that you say and do, shows up in your productivity and results and things that, again, super, super high level. It's helpful to know where you are because depending on where you are determines what you do, right? And so when you think about these things in the book, it's very much the same way. Look, leadership is exhausting. Why? Because it involves people. It involves people. And that's not a negative thing. In fact, I was doing something for a brand this morning and used the quote, and the quote, this is a little LOL, so don't judge me or send me an email, anybody. But the three-word phrase was, humans are inconvenient. And as much as it's like, God, it's kind of funny, I mean, think about church staff, caregiver. There is an element, you may never say it out loud, but you may when you're sitting alone in a chair, you're sitting alone on a couch, you're driving down the road to that next appointment, pick up a prescription, take somebody, you're thinking about it, right? And so that's where you have to be careful because you have to be careful not to stay there, right? And you have to begin to, yes, I mean, you think on the church staff side, even caregiver side, like, but if it weren't for that person, then I wouldn't have any ministry to do, and again, simply said. But yeah, so just talking about exhaustion and burnout, depending on which it is, would determine how you show up and handle it.
Okay, so, and burnout, like you said, happens because, we often are pushing beyond that exhaustion limit. We are going beyond that fatigue. We aren't maybe catching those signs that pop up where we can make those smaller tweaks. So we do end up in burnout a lot. It is very common. It's common across the board. There's entire podcasts on leadership burnout, on, first responder burnout, on caregiver burnout, all of this stuff. So let's talk a little bit about what we can do if we're like, okay, I've tried to make all these tweaks. And I think that's a lot of times when caregivers say, I need better self-care, they're thinking, if I can just tweak my diet, if I can just tweak my sleep, if I can just tweak my exercise, I won't be so tired. And it's like, that's not going to be your answer now because you're already over here in burnout. So let's talk a little bit about when we realize none of those small tweaks are working. We've got to do something different. What are some things that we can that we need to put in place?
You could take these for what they're worth, and they're again high level just because of time. But it's really admitting that you feel a certain way. You're like, this sounds very much like therapy, but it really is an admission because it's kind of like if you remember old school, we used to go to the mall as a kid, and it's like I'd find that little spot. Oh, I want to go to that store. Where am I? The little red mark. You are here. Okay, I need to go there. It's a little bit like that. Like, I need to know, where am I? Because if I don't know where I'm at, then it's really going to be difficult for me to traverse wherever I need to go, right? So again, very, very simple way to say it. So I need to say, you know what? I feel, I have brain fog. I used to care about people. I don't anymore. I used to care about things. I don't anymore. I have no energy. I'm thinking negative thoughts I never thought before. I mean, again, just some kind of spitballing examples, but it's acknowledging where you are, and then it's literally, and this is what I do sometimes, and people probably think I'm crazy, I will literally admit it out loud, like just verbally say, like, I feel blank because blank. And so for me, because the adage is this, there's an old adage that is, if you can name it, you can tame it. So if I don't put a word to something, then there is a very small chance that I'm going to be able to tame whatever it is. So I'm going to just say it out loud. I'm going to name it. And then I'm just going to accept where I'm at. That's saying you're just going to accept and settle. Accepting and settling, that's not what I'm talking about. It's accepting the fact that, you know what, I am where I'm at. So what do I do? Well, for me, the next thing is I need to give myself permission to move forward in a healthy way. And I know this almost sounds crazy, Jeanette, but sometimes working with people, I can literally ask them a question or say something that's almost kind of like permission giving. And sometimes I've been perplexed why that is so effective. And I think sometimes we just don't give ourselves permission to stop this, start this, whatever it might be. And so it is giving yourself permission. Maybe the last thing I'll share is in this process, and this may not be linear. I'm talking in a linear fashion, may not be that way.
Right.
Is circling yourself with people that can help you move forward. Right? A group of trusted people. And I talk in the book about 11 types of people you could have in your life. But circling yourself up with people you could trust to help you move forward. Because, hey, look, you might have gotten to this place alone. You will not get out of this place alone.
No, absolutely not. Okay, I love this. And for those of you listening, you just have to know that I did not talk to Jason about anything that I'm doing on the self-caregiver side of things before this. But Jason, what you've essentially done is you have laid out essentially how I walk other caregivers through changing their situation, because the first thing we talk about is self-awareness, which I call it self-awareness, but it's that same idea of you can't take care of yourself if you can't even connect with yourself enough to know where you are and what you need. All the self-care things won't help if they're not actually what you need, right? And then the second thing that I talk about is the self-advocacy, which there's two components in that, which we can get to this next. But there's the boundaries and the support system. So you have to advocate for yourself and say, I need help. And then also set a boundary for what, because one of the reasons nobody's helping you is because you act like you can do it all.
You know what? The boundary thing, and we may step into that. I'm going to kind of wade into the water. The other two pieces to add on to what we're saying are related to the boundaries. And one boundary is this. Yeah. And this may be more church staff than caregiving, but maybe there's a relationship there. Is whatever it was that helped we never just exhaustion and burnout never just show up at 3 a.m. because they decided to leave the house at 12 midnight and to show up at your house. It's never like that. It's this slow drift of progression. You don't even necessarily feel it until you feel it, right? So the two kind of last pieces, if you will, if there are last pieces, are related to boundaries. And it's one, you got to get free from the symptoms that actually got you there. So in other words, I'm going to put a boundary up. I need to know what was it or who was it. And I got to get free from those things, right? And the last thing is, you know what? I'm going to draw a mental line in the sand. I don't have to stay like this. In fact, I say this in the leadership space. It's in the book. Burnout in leadership is not inevitable. But you know what? I was told all of my from undergrad, grad, doctoral programs, working with leaders, it's just part of it. It comes with the territory. Right. And it's well, is there another option? Because it doesn't sound appealing. So when you think about boundaries, I think about these last two pieces. The last thing I'll say on boundaries is this. It might be how you define a boundary. So in the book, we talk about it a little bit differently. Boundary is often thought of, not right or wrong, as a wall, right? Keep things out, keep things in. For us, we like to think of a boundary as a gate. Because sometimes in this season, I need to keep, certain things out and certain things in. But guess what? Next season, there's things that were out, I need in, and the things that were in, I need out. And so the gate allows there to be movement. And so for us, it just feels a little bit better. Feels like there has some flexibility and mobility, more so than a wall. Again, not right or wrong. It's just a different way to see it.
No. We talk about a gate. Sometimes we talk about, I read a book years ago. I don't even know. I need to figure out who it is so I can give them credit. But the idea of a moat, an old school, moat, like a drawbridge, like you let it down and you bring it up. Well, no, it would be a moat because a drawbridge is still a bridge. But anyway, this idea that's there's times that you just got to shut that door, and the mode is there. That's your boundary, and you've locked it down. And then other times you want to let people in, you need to let them in. Maybe they need the protection that you can provide, whatever. But another thing I learned about boundaries is I kept setting a boundary and being so upset when people were not respecting them. Like, goodness gracious, I told you I was not going to get in my car and come over there, blah, 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 blah. And then it's like, well, they're not the ones getting in their car and coming to you. You're the one getting in your car and going to them. So one thing that I always remind people about boundaries is when you set a boundary, whether it's a time boundary or a person boundary or a physical boundary, it's something that you're going to do or not do, or say or not say. Or whatever. It's not about what the other people are going to do or not do. So that was like, I just remember the one time, literally, I was driving in my car, just like having the bad attitude in my head about it. Like, oh my, how dare they? Da, 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 da. And then I was like, well, I mean, I'm the one in the car like an innie. I mean, I'm a nincompoop. I'm the one. And then I was like, okay, so next time I'll know that I don't have to get in the car, even if they expect me to, right? So, but yeah, so that, I really love that we've had this conversation, and I love that there's this same sense of when you are experiencing burnout, no matter what role you're in, it's all about finding where you are, that self-awareness, and then starting to give yourself permission and advocate for yourself and start setting those boundaries and so that you can move forward. Because you can't get to, like in our case, we talk about self-care in our community. You can't get to self-care until you have all these other pieces in place, until you have that awareness, until you have those boundaries, until you have that support system. And then you've got to set your goals. Like, what are you moving toward? You can't just move away from something without moving towards something
it's so good.
else.
And this may be a sobering statistic. It's a newer statistic. But when you think about self-awareness, and this is more in the leadership space, so this is not in the caregiving space, but this may highlight we're not as good as we think we are at being self-aware. So when I work with leaders in the self-awareness or in the leadership space and assessment, 85+% think they're self-aware. They have an overestimation of their awareness of tendencies, triggers, etc.
Yeah.
Newer research says that number at best is 15%, but it fluctuates between 10 and 15%. So it's just a revelation, kind of a sobering revelation that reminds us in our humanity, I'm not that good at realizing these things about me, which that's where you invite that circle of trusted people that can help you. Because if you can get some words around it, then you're more likely to get a plan around it.
Right. And I also love what you said about like giving people permission, or having them like opening the door of possibility. Like just even the question, like, you're a bad caregiver, who says? Like even giving them the idea that they could even redefine that for themselves. And so I love that. But of course you can't do that if you're alone in your silo and you're not reaching out. So this has been such a great conversation. I feel like we could do Jason, we could have our own podcast, honestly. But do you, before we wrap things up, I just want to thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your knowledge on burnout and what are the things that we need to do to get through it. I really appreciate your time and the work that you do for leaders. And I do think caregivers are leaders. I think whether we want to or not, we have to lead people, even if it's just the one person we're caring for, but also sometimes it ends up being that whole care team that we're responsible for. And so I feel like this conversation is going to be so helpful for our listeners. And so I do appreciate that. Thank you for coming on and being with me. Do you have anything else you want to share, any encouragement or insight for our caregivers today?
The foreword to the book, a pastor wrote, and I'll just kind of leave you with these words. On one of the pages, he wrote, "Discouragement precedes destruction. Discouragement drains our energy and pulls us down, but encouragement restores our energy." And so when we think about whether you're church staff or a caregiver, we all need encouragement. And so maybe for you, you need some wind in your sail, you need some fuel in that tank. And so maybe right now it's about inviting someone or some people or kind of breaking your rhythm that's not working so that you can be encouraged and you can get some of that back into your life and you can begin to see that energy restored and that pep in your step. You might just be one step away from seeing your encouragement restored. And you know what? Burnout, it's not inevitable. You might just have to make a few little decisions. But I think God really does want to encourage you through other people, and I think other people want to encourage you.
That is so great, Jason. Thank you. And it's a perfect time, if I may, pitch the self-caregiver community. I will be putting the link for people to join that. If you want to get encouragement as a caregiver specifically about your own self-care efforts, this is the community for you. I focus, and we all focus in there on what we are currently doing about self-care, which includes getting ourselves out of burnout. So sometimes it's not bubble baths and pedicures. Sometimes we really are talking about those hard things. But the goal of that group, the self-caregiver community, is about helping caregivers really take care of themselves. Because like you said, we do need, we hear it all the time, and sometimes caregivers roll their eyes, honestly, when people are like, well, you can't take care of others, or you're not taking care of yourself. And that is true. But what I have found is that when you go into your self-care practice as a caregiver, because you are worthy of that care, and even if you think about it from that faith perspective of, if you're thinking about yourself as a creation, then that's pretty important. If you've been, if you think that you're created by God, then God thought enough of you to create you. You're important enough to take care of just because you're who you are. And of course, if you're not of the same faith I am, I just want to tell you that you are worthy as a human, as a person. And so if you go into self-care with that mindset of like, I'm just taking care of myself because I'm worthy of it. I'm a person, I'm a human, I exist in this world. Spoiler alert, you will also become a better caregiver.
That's good.
Like, it's going to happen. But, let's stop just trying to take care of ourselves so that we can give it away to somebody else. Let's take care of ourselves because we deserve it. But please head to the show notes if you want to check out that community. Thank you again, Jason. I appreciate you. And thank you for joining me today. From Guilt to Good podcast is a proud member of the Whole Care Podcast Network. To access additional self-care resources that help you feel good, not guilty, check out the show notes for this episode. Subscribe now and join me in going from guilt to good so that you can rediscover your worth, reclaim your health, and get back the life that you've been too busy to enjoy. And if you've enjoyed this show, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback matters. We're redefining self-care for caregivers one episode at a time. Until next time, remember, you are worthy of the same care you give others.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.